Good afternoon, good morning, good evening. I'm Victor Fung. I'm the co-chair of the Asian Global Institute, and it's my great honor to moderate the session today with all of you. First of all, a very warm digital welcome to our distinguished panelists, Marie Pangestu, who is waking up very early in Washington, D.C., and Mike Spence, who is zooming in from Milan in Italy. And of course, all of you from around the world, really a very, very warm welcome from all of us from the Asian Global Institute. Marie, as you all know, is the Managing Director of Development Policy and Partnership at the World Bank. And of course, you are all familiar with Mike Spence, who is Nobel Laureate in Economics and is an advisory board member of the AGI. This is a truly global audience, really engaging, in my mind, in a subject of enormous global significance, especially at this time in the world's development. And this is really what the AGI is all about, our opportunity to convene speakers like Marie and Mike to really address these global issues with you at this crucial time. Today, our two global thinkers will help us understand the long-term impact of the pandemic on the global economic situation, and of course, how the international order is faring throughout all this, and really how this will be evolved as we know it. So let me first of all turn really to the global economy and how we really see things evolving post-pandemic. You know, as we all know, the IMF has actually predicted that the world this year could be going as much as into a negative 4.9% in growth. This is really quite amazing compared to a trend line of 3.5% that we have seen in the previous decades. So this is a significant 8.4% below the trend line. I think we should all know that this, if you could have a standard of comparison, is many times more severe than what we saw during the global financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. But what is even more worrying, perhaps, is we expect that perhaps up to 500 million people around the world could be pushed back below the poverty line. And that is certainly a problem that we all have to address in the very long run. So Mike, let me first turn to you. What do you make of all this trend? And is it, how bad do you see things? And really, are there any things that you see in the horizon that may be able to allow us to ameliorate some of this?
Thank you very much, Victor. Somebody raise their hands if you're having trouble hearing me. I suspect there are a lot of old friends or longtime friends on the call, and I'm kind of sad I can't see you and talk with you. But I want to send warm best wishes and a hope to see everybody in the relatively near future. And I'm really delighted to be back at AGI, even if it's virtually, and to be together with Marie and Victor. I just treasure the times we get together and have a chance to chat and compare notes and try to think about how to improve matters. So Victor asked me to talk about the global economy, and then Marie will take over and give us some thoughts on what we need to improve the directionality of our global economy and its governance. This is obviously a very difficult situation that we're in. So I somewhat facetiously say I got to describe the very difficult situation, and Marie gets to describe how to fix it. So I probably have the easier job in this context. I am firmly of the belief that attempting to sort of think about the long term in view of what we're going through now without paying attention to what we're actually going through and what its consequences will be is a mistake. And so I'm going to spend some time talking about, we're now, 5 or 6 months into this, depending on which country you're talking about in the starting point. I'm going to spend some time talking about what's going on in what some friends of mine in Hangzhou call a pandemic economy. And much of what I have to say is drawn from a project they have in tracking both the economy and the virus in real time. I find this work very interesting and highly useful. You know, there are leaders all over the world, policymakers and politicians who have the enormous challenge of making real-time, day-to-day decisions about how we're going to deal with our economy in the context of trying to control a virus. They're trading off livelihoods and lives and so on. And they don't need out-of-date data. They need real-time data. They need to know what's going on in the economy. So the Luan Academy in Hangzhou has been, they're pretty good at data because they came out of Alibaba and Ant Financial, have been tracking the coevolution of the economy and the virus in real time with daily updates in 132 countries. And they do this using mobility data as a way to estimate the level of economic activity or the magnitude of the contraction. So that's roughly what's going on. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the details, but I'd like to tell you, after staring at this for a long time over several months, what seems to be going on. So the first observation is that the pandemic economy, this coevolution I referred to, is coming at us in waves. The first wave was in China and a few other East Asian countries. And the second wave, they dealt with the virus aggressively, and in a number of cases, they got on it early and have experienced, in the non-China cases, relatively modest contractions and relatively successful programs of controlling the virus. The second wave encompasses most of the developed economies in the world, almost all of whom got a late start and simply missed the window for targeted containment via testing and tracking, with or without the use of digital technology. In the case of these economies, mostly without. And all of them exhibit a similar pattern, which is an extremely steep, sharp contraction, followed by a trough in which the economy is essentially locked down, business and sectors are closed, education is either halted or moved entirely online. And then hopefully you get the virus under control. There are a lot of ways to measure that, but one way is the new cases are smaller than the recoveries from the virus, so that you're actually declining in terms of the prevalence of the virus in the population. I'll come to the third wave in a moment because it's important. But for those economies in the recovery mode, that is, they've passed this milestone, and there are only, if you take the 30 largest global economies, only 14 of them are in recovery mode. That is, they're on a path where the virus is more or less under control and opening up and doing this sort of, day by day, difficult management process of making slow and steady progress in both reducing the magnitude of the contraction and controlling the virus. A lot of people talk about the shape of the recovery. There really isn't a V-shaped recovery. The only cases that would approximate that are the ones that got on it early, and you can count them on the fingers of one hand, or in the China case, because the virus control program was so large and comprehensive and aggressive, and so heavily supported with digital tools, that there was a remarkably quick transition from essentially lockdown to a recovery path. Everybody else's path looks slower and more difficult for the obvious reasons that the lockdowns have been less stringent, came later, and so on. We see, if you look at this from a macro point of view, Victor mentioned these numbers. First of all, we see a familiar pattern of downward revisions, which if you think back to the great financial crisis, you'll recognize. But all of the forecasts include a very large negative shock. But if you want to know what's going to happen in the economy, you have to know how long that shock is going to last, and what the particular path of recovery is going to look like. Let me give an example. The EU just projected for the EU, they did it for the Eurozone and so on, but for the EU as a whole, that 2020 would show a minus 8.3 drop in GDP. And their projection for 2021 is 6.1%. That doesn't really even come close to getting back to where we started at the end of 2019. You need growth of over 9% in 2021 in order to, so I don't know whether these forecasts are optimistic or pessimistic, but to think that we're going to be out of this before well into 2022 strikes me as at least, on the optimistic side, if not wildly optimistic. But my view of these, if you're going to make these forecasts for what's going to happen in the global economy and in particular economies, then you have to guess at what's going to happen on these recovery paths that I was just talking about. And that's a very difficult thing to do because we're operating in an environment that none of us has experienced before. And you have to make those guesses out several quarters. So my view is, one way to think about it is that we just don't know. So we're living in a world of quite radical uncertainty with respect to these kinds of numbers. And that, I think, should guide policy, business, investment, and other decisions. Now, let me turn to the third wave. Oh, one final point on there have been studies of the distributional impact of the pandemic economy within specific economies, meaning domestically. And they're not pretty. They're all adverse. That pandemic economy appears to hit the lower parts of the income distribution the hardest, more or less regardless of where you are. So let me give an example to kind of make this less abstract. In the United States economy, a study was done at the University of Chicago, which was an attempt to estimate how many jobs can be done from home. And the answer overall was 33%, or a third. But then they did it by sector. And the lowest sector in terms of the fraction of jobs that could be done from home was the hospitality sector. That's, restaurants, hotels, food service, et cetera. And that number was 4%. So almost all of it's, and that sector was essentially shut down as part of the pandemic economy control, virus control process. And it employs approximately 17 million people in the US. So it's just an example, but that's a lot of people who are either on unemployment insurance or struggling to get by or have been furloughed or some combination of the above. And you can tell that story. And this is not to mention small businesses like restaurants, who may or may not return, and a whole range of service businesses. So, so I think the post-pandemic agenda is going to need to include serious attention to these distributional things. And I'll come to some more of them in a minute. It is true that in the developed economies, there are huge fiscal programs that were designed to buffer these shocks and to some extent redistribute the economic hit. You can think of it as balance sheet damage, if you like. And that by and large, and those policies were backed by central banks in the case where there might be, instability in the sovereign debt markets. So what's going on, in part, is a transfer of the damage to the sovereign balance sheet. Now that will have long-run consequences, but my view is that set of policies was wise, was done quickly and in very large magnitudes. And at least for the countries that had the fiscal space to do it with the central bank backing, I think they did the right thing. That doesn't mean there won't be any residual damage in the financial sector, in the household sector, in the business sector, but it will be less than it was before, and it will facilitate a more rapid economic recovery than we might have had otherwise. The third wave is where we are now. It is well over half the new confirmed cases of the virus in the global economy. It's probably approaching 60%, and it includes almost all the emerging and developing economies if you exclude the East Asian ones that I mentioned before. And here are the tracking patterns that I described earlier. I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the tracking patterns start out the same way. There's a delayed response while people realize that there's a serious sort of virus spread problem, and usually a relatively sharp contraction. But then the pattern starts to diverge. And the worrying thing that we're seeing in a very large number of economies is that instead of moving in terms of increased virus control while you're in the trough, and then starting this gradual upward movement, both, virus control on one dimension and reduced contraction on the other, economies are getting stuck in terms of virus control in an area where the virus is spreading. So to a first approximation, if the total cases of the virus are doubling faster than in 20 days or less, the virus is probably expanding rapidly in the economy. If you're at 10 days, it's out of control. The reason for that is obvious. I mean, the virus has a kind of 3-week to roughly life cycle, when a person's infected. So if you're doubling, in 10 days, then you're adding an awful lot of people. And so these are the patterns we're seeing. They're not particularly well known, but we see it in Brazil, in India, in Pakistan, and in general, the general point is that it looks like it's harder to get control of the virus in these economies, even with very difficult lockdowns. Now, I don't think we've got sufficiently detailed studies of this done yet, but people speculate, and I think they're mostly right, that especially in the poorer economies, you can't sustain a very lengthy lockdown, and you just can't survive. And so what's going on is the lockdowns are more leaky because they have to be to keep people from, there are migrant populations, there are people in the informal sector, who don't have the resources. And at the national level, both the medical and the fiscal capacities are lower than in some of the developed countries. So bottom line, I guess, Victor and Marie, is that this is a very difficult situation. And it looks like it's very hard to know how these patterns will go. But my suspicion is that there'll be a kind of forced premature opening of the economy to deal with the livelihood question, and there'll be a kind of humanitarian challenge associated with that occurring in the context of the virus spreading more rapidly than we saw in the other economies' trajectories. I wish I didn't have to say this, but that pattern that I just described with a slight variant is starting to emerge in some of the states in the United States. That is because those patterns typically have a lockdown and some virus control and then backtracking. And you can see in a number of we have the data for this now, because it can be done at the level, at the state or even local level. That you can see states are backtracking very rapidly into the danger zone with respect to virus control. I never expected to see that, but it's pretty clear that's what's going on. So I may have overshot my time limit, but let me summarize this part by saying the following things. One, it's fine to talk about where we're going to be in the future, and I think it's important, but we're a long way from being through this, especially if you focus on the developing countries. Second, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about these forward paths. They're not determined, they're not predetermined. They depend on very sensitive decision-making by the people, our elected leaders, and others who are supporting them. And by the way, they're the people who should be making these decisions because they have involved values. I don't think there's any reasonable chance, at least at the global level in most economies, of seeing a V-shaped recovery. Before we started, Victor said, well, are we going to see an L-shaped non-recovery? And my answer to that is, I doubt it. Significant economies are actually improving, albeit slowly, in the context of reasonable containment of the virus. These economic hits, having said that, these economic hits are very, very large and will leave residual damage sort of all over the economy. So I think we're in for a slow and probably slower than the kind of majority view out there, whatever that is, recovery with a very difficult tail at the end, because there are certain sectors that are really hard to open. You know, anything involving very large groups of people. Schools. Schools is a huge challenge. It really doesn't make sense to open schools, you know, if you don't have pretty complete control of the virus. And yet, all over the world, people are you know, we have these complicated plans for school openings that involve, you know, half of the people there and half of the people not, and the rest online. And, you know, everybody's read about these things, so I won't, you know, spend, you know, hours talking about it. But they're all really poor second choices relative to having the young people together in school. I mean, online education's better than no education, and we've seen both in many economies, but it's a really poor second best. So there's for certain sectors, there's a very high priority if they're going to recover. And international travel, you know, includes tourism. I live in a country that's heavily dependent on tourism here in Italy. We have only Europeans coming. The Americans aren't allowed to come. Chinese, we're having a fight over visas, reciprocal fight over visas, and so on. And finally, the distributional characteristics, both domestically and internationally, are sufficiently bad that I think they deserve to be high priority items on the forward-looking agenda for dealing with it.
Well, Mike, thank you very much for that fascinating exposition. You know, I must say that the first thing that strikes me as a businessman and really looking at it from the ground up is that we better be prepared for a long one. And we really must remain very flexible, resilient, and adaptable as we go through this. But there's one quick question I'd like to ask you before we actually move on to Marie, and to look at some of the things that we could do on a multilateral basis and from multilateral institutions is, when this begin to actually take shape, as we see the light at the end of the tunnel, are there likely to be different emphasis in different geographic regions of the world? And in the following sense, I think the world has seen over the last decade, perhaps a migration of the center of the economic activity towards Asia. Do you think this will be accelerated as a result of the pandemic?
Not significantly on that last point, but it's certainly a trend, and it's a non-trivial trend. So I'm not sure I could identify factors that would be accelerators, but there are some things that are going to change significantly, either are or should. So one of the things we should have, and Marie may want to talk about this, is there's going to be enough debt in the developing world that we're going to have debt relief. I mean, I just absolutely clear, either that or abandon a whole bunch of countries to a fate. And I can't believe we live in a world in which we're willing to do that. So second, digital has turned out to be an enormous, I mean, digital underpinnings of economies was a trend. And as you've said often, Victor, this pandemic has accelerated, amplified trends all over the place, including especially the digital ones. Then I think, you know, there'll be a bunch of businesses will take this on. My view is some sectors will rapidly increase the pace of digital adoption, new business models that are kind of hybrids, some of which were underway, and omni-channel characteristics will come into play, and others will be, you know, seem like they're new because it was going more slowly. Telemedicine, for example, and so on. Similar things in schooling. If you go down the retail. But I think what we'll see is an acceleration. And then the question is, you know, can we get around to, you know, addressing these sort of fragmentation issues in the digital economy world that we're experiencing now? Because as the digital economy becomes a more important part of the way the economy is put together, the fragmentation from the benefits of globalization and global cooperation become more costly. And so in terms of future agenda, I would think that you, other leaders, the International Chamber of Commerce and the international institutions will probably want to tackle this.
I think that's going to be a very big issue. Let me come back to that in a moment. Marie, let me turn to you. You've been very patient. You know, hearing what Mike has said, I can't help but think that one of the major issues that will be exacerbated as one of the results of the pandemic would be the distribution of income issues, and also the discrepancies between the rich and the poor. And how are we going to be able to handle this from a global perspective? And you know, what are the multilateral institutions? Are they in a position to address some of these very fundamental issues? And where do you think this will lead us in terms of how we can actually use some of our multilateral institutions to really change the course of this, the impact of this pandemic?
Oh, that was a very big question, but let me try to answer it very much from a developing country perspective, and just what we are going through as the World Bank in trying to give assistance to so many developing countries. And I will focus on kind of the framework that Mike has nicely laid out, in the sense that, you know, we are in the problem is that the economic lockdown and the economic slowdown is synchronous across the world, but the pandemic is not synchronous. You know, you have different waves, and sometimes you have a second wave after you thought that you had contained it. So this is, I think, the first takeaway based on what Mike just said is that, and you also emphasized that this is not something that's going to go away anytime soon. It's nothing like SARS, where after a few months, then we go back to normal. It's nothing like that. And we are in for, I think, at least 2 to 4 years, depending on how sharp you come down and how quickly you're able to do smart containment and so on. So I think it's the very deep recession, and it's going to take us a long time. Many countries will struggle, especially the developing countries with very low capacity, to come out of it back to where they were before the COVID hit. It can be anything. I think between 2 to 4, even longer, depending on how bad the damage is happening in your particular country, and that's a factor of all the things that Mike said. How quickly were you in the containment? How you opened up, and how you were able to do your stimulus program appropriately, and so on and so forth. And developing countries obviously do not have deep pockets like the US or Europe, where they can have blanket stimulus across all sectors of firms or households. We have to face the trade-offs of which households do you rescue, which firms do you rescue. So I think just to emphasize that, you mentioned the IMF, so I have to not correct you, but at least add the World Bank projections. And yes. Actually, the IMF has already revised its projections. The world economy is going like from minus 5.2 to 8%, worst baseline and worst case. Worst case means a longer pandemic, a protracted pandemic, financial crisis, commodity prices dropping further, retreat from global value chains, and a very long return of consumer and investor confidence. So that's kind of the world we're in. And some developing countries are in a very bad shape. You said you mentioned the poverty numbers. Basically, it's extreme poverty is going from 70 to 300 million, depending on the scenario. And it's worse when the inequality is increasing. And the worst hit region is South Asia. Second worst region hit on poverty is Sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of contraction, Latin America is the worst. It's predicted to contract between -6 to something like -8 or -9%. East Asia is actually the best performing region, contracting at about 0% to about -2%. So this is the differences across countries is exactly what Mike said. It depends on your capacity, your health systems. A lot of the poor countries have very weak health systems. And we are talking about, countries with no ICU units, for instance, or no ventilators. So let me just answer your question by perhaps an easy way for me to answer your question is just to explain what needs to be done in the kind of emergency short-term phase, and then what happens at the relief stage, what happens at the recovery stage, what countries should be doing, and what should be the role of regional or multilateral cooperation. So very briefly, in the emergency phase, which is what's already happened on the ground, the World Bank did come out with what we call an emergency health program, a supply of ventilators, supply of protective clothing, addressing the weaknesses in the health system, making sure or trying to supply water. You say everybody has to wash hands, but there are so many places, including in medical facilities, where there's not enough water, right? So something so basic like ensuring supply of water is something that we focus on. So we came up with kind of what I would call a platform of responses. And we came up with our own assistance, but I think the regional and global cooperation comes in where we go into a country and then we partner with other donors or other NGOs or other UN agencies, whether it's World Food Program, WHO, to deliver on the ground. So that part I think has actually worked out very well. But kind of in the next stage, which is, I'll address the health issue. The next big health issue is the vaccine and the therapeutic medicine. Okay, and here we had a lot of, and also food, by the way, we had restrictions, as you know, trade restrictions, because countries want to make sure, I want to make sure I have enough food and medicine for my own population. So we restrict, right? And there was a huge call from the G20 and the world. We also made our statements. Everybody came to make statements, and it didn't go away, but it kind of, G20 made a statement saying, okay, if you're going to impose restrictions for emergency purposes, you have to do it in a transparent way, measured way, and time bound, right? It trying to put discipline to it. And you're supposed to notify it to the WTO. Whether or not there has any teeth in the WTO, I don't know. But it did slow it down. It didn't make it go away, but it did slow it down. So that's the portion of international cooperation there. Not perfect, but it's there. On the vaccine and the therapeutic medicine, I think, and this is where, okay, what is the new multilateral? I think multilateral cooperation or global cooperation is a necessity, because this is the nature of the problem we are facing is global. And you want to be able to start opening up, not just in your country, but opening up between each other as well. And the vaccine is not the magic bullet. Therapeutic medicine is not the magic bullet, but it's part of the answer to give certainty. So actually, what we have been experiencing, at least on the cooperation, global cooperation on vaccine and therapeutic medicine, there has been quite a good cooperation, and it was not led by the WHO. It was led by a coalition of the willing, if you like. So this is the other point that I would like to make, is that we are maybe suffering from the lack of very strong multilateral organizations that can lead the way, and then everybody follows. It has to be what I call a coalition of the willing, and perhaps what we would call a coalition around certain issues which people can actually agree on, right? And on vaccine and therapeutics, at least there is cooperation between all these WHO and other health partners, Gates, and the pharmaceutical firms to agree that whoever finds the vaccine first, the funding was raised by the EU to support research and development. The World Bank is coming in by saying, okay, we will provide what's called advanced market commitments. So if the vaccine is found, we want to make sure that poor countries get it. So we say, okay, we will purchase X amount so that you have the scale for the manufacturing. So you have bring in different partners with different capacity to be able to say, okay, we need to work hard to agree on the production of the therapeutics and the medicine. And there's an IPR component where you want to make it what's called compulsory licensing. So countries can actually not have to pay the patent, but produce it domestically so that you can have global free access. So there's private sector, there's health partners, there are foundations, there are global corporations, there's the multilaterals. That's just an example of where it's not perfect. it's quite possible that whoever finds the vaccine first, say it's China, some countries may not want to use it. I don't know what will happen, but hopefully it doesn't go, it doesn't get politicized. That the urgency of having the vaccine is very clear. Now, in the relief stage, which is who knows when, I think Mike made a good point that what you do now and what's happening now has a bearing on what happens in the subsequent stages. So if you were late to contain, you're going to suffer a bigger impact economically, right? So it's really that's something we also observe. The short-term policies that a country takes, the leadership, the ability to communicate, the ability to do good tracing, containment, and so on, has a big bearing on the relief stage and the recovery stage, and how much harm is done to households, to firms, to the financial sector, and so on. So this is where countries are at different stages, and we are really working what types of policies need to be there to help countries. And Mike mentioned debt relief. Debt relief is definitely one of the big issues. Many countries came into this crisis already with a big debt overhang. IMF and the World Bank actually did come up with an initiative which was adopted by G20 for debt suspension for the poorest countries until the end of the year by bilateral official creditors. And then I think it's going to be extended. And at the same time, the multilaterals will come in with new, fresh money. So you have the fiscal space to actually do something to save livelihoods. I just want to mention that you mentioned inequality. Yes, Mike also mentioned that the hardest hit are the lower income groups. Because the large proportion of informal sector that just immediately loses their income during this lockdown. And we also have found a lot of other dimensions. It impacts women worse than men. So the policies that we implement, we have to make sure that we understand the different impact between men and women. We have seen increase in gender-based violence, effects on maternal health because health services are all going to pandemic, and loss of income is worse for women than men. And the other big issue for us is human capital. It's the notion of the lost generation, schools being closed down, and even after schools started opening up, the lower income groups, this is based on studies on previous crisis, not all the children go back to school. And girls have a higher prevalence of not going back to school. So these are some of the really on the ground, we must make sure that if we're not going to have increased inequality and just a destruction of human capital, which will make it much harder for countries to come out of the crisis, we have to have policies both at the national level and how does the cooperation come in to help countries deliver education. I think it's going to have to be a combination of online. I would say not. It's what is it? Off-site and on-site. Some of it, some return back in a contained way to school, but a lot of it still needs to be delivered outside. And it's not just digital. Okay, we know the problem. Not all developing countries are digitally connected. So we go back to the old way. We have revived a lot of the old ways of communication, radio, television, and just your traditional cell phone for delivering curriculum education materials. So I think the final thing I would say is that I know I'm kind of running out of time on the trade, because I know that that's your issue. So on the trade, on the short term, making sure that trade restrictions on food and medicine do not lead to shortages and spikes in prices like what happened in 2008 is one of the short-term priorities, and that requires G20, G7, as well as to the extent WTO can say something, and that's happening. But in the medium term, how do we address the increased protectionism and breakdown of value chain, and what is the global value chain going to look like? That's a much bigger, longer-term issue, and I think this is a big issue because we know that, especially for East Asia, trade and openness has been the way development has happened in our part of the world, and that's also should be the way other regions experience it. So here we really need to get down and make sure that both at the regional level, so regional economic integration, East Asia again actually has provided some good examples with the, what is it, TPP 11, CPTPP, as well as the RCEP, which is still happening, right?
Yes.
So you're opening up within yourselves, you're opening up, and you're big enough to actually, if you open up, you will benefit the rest of the world. And at the same time, the coalition of the willing to make sure that the multilateral WTO rules of the trade continues to prevail, to prevent, I think, to prevent the bilateral tensions that we know between the two largest countries. The only way is actually to address it multilaterally. And just to close that, there is an example of, it's kind of like, okay, we know there's lots of problems, but we do what we can. If you know that the dispute settlement, for instance, the big problem in the WTO, there are 12 countries, you know, Europe, Australia, Singapore, Canada. They've decided that, okay, we can't solve this, but at least between us, the coalition of the willing, we continue to do we have introduced the dispute, a new way to do this dispute settlement. So just to share with you that not all is lost, but it's not a perfect world. We are in a perfect storm. We have to have global cooperation. We need to do what we can with all the different platforms that we have.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Marie, for that fascinating exposition. I must say that it's very clear after listening to both our distinguished speakers that we're going to be in for a long haul. And there's going to be some major issues around the world, especially in the less developed area and the more disadvantaged members of our society, even in the developed countries that really would need help. The real point in my mind is, you know, I think what we really need to do is to make sure that we continue to cooperate, you know, between communities and between economies and between nations. I suppose the question that one has to ask is, are the present multilateral institutions really up to the task and of having to actually deal with this massive issue? And if not, then maybe what are the things that we need to do together to think about perhaps a new form of multilateralism to deal with that in the very long run? I know from a businessman standpoint, I think on the, you know, thinking about large businesses, small businesses from all around the world, I think the thing that we would be really worried about is, first of all, what is the availability of jobs? Where are the employments going to be created? And then the second thing is, you know, where is the demand going to be created? That's why I asked the original question, Mike. Are there going to be different emphasis in terms of the markets around the world that we should be focusing on? And has the pandemic fundamentally shifted these emphases on where your eventual markets are? You know, I think the global supply chains are all under pressure right now. I think it's probably a little easier to think about the supply side being, in a sense, revitalized, but it's much harder, I think, given what you say about the future of the pandemic, to think about a complete revival of the demand side. And as you say, you know, you can probably count on one hand any economy that even have a reasonable short-term V-shaped recovery. There will be a rebound in 2021. It's nowhere going to be near back to the original level. And there's be a real shortage, I think, of global demand. So those will be translated into issues that we need to deal with from around the world. So I think you guys have really brought out some of the key things that I think all of us around the world and people who are participating, whether it's from the private sector or from the business and NGO sector, really need to think about. I think given the time that we have, it's time for us, there's a whole flood of questions coming in. And I think we should really now focus on that. Let me start off with the first one. You know, it's really asking the question, has the pandemic really forced the economists to really rethink the foundations of international trade? Have we prompted governments really to look inward and do a lot of what people would call reshoring, the idea of doing essential products domestically and develop local supply chains, really for long-term development, as opposed to really thinking about global trade. What are your thoughts on this?
If I may comment, go ahead.
Okay, Marie. Yep.
I think there is that fear, and it doesn't help that what we're seeing is actually, at the moment, we hope this will change, that sense will come back. Countries are actually competing. It's not firms anymore that are competing. It's countries competing and say, okay, I want to make sure I can produce my own medicine. I can produce my own medical supplies, my own food. And some countries like Japan gives a subsidy for companies to come back and manufacture in Japan. So I think there is a bit of this, but we hope that the realization is that it's going to cost you more. It's again, I think the basic economics of efficiency argument is still there. And what needs to happen is more that you should if you're afraid of being not having the supplies, you need to diversify, including, in the global value chain kind of a dependency or concentration kind of argument. Diversification is the answer. And that international coordination and cooperation is even more key here. To make sure that you don't have these kind of policies that distort unnecessarily these decisions. But I think to be real, politically, a lot of countries will still be looking inward and undertaking protectionist policies. But it needs to be shown that it actually hurts your country and your people more, because you end up paying higher prices and probably not also getting the access to whether it's food or medicine to put it in the more emergency context. We haven't even talked about other products. So I think we need to have a healthy discussion about this. And just to close, I think services, you asked the question, where is the kind of demand, where is the future sources of growth? I think with the pandemic, with the home-based work and the kind of the acceleration of the use of digital, is actually showing that a lot of things can be done digitally. And this is actually, I would say, one of the areas of promise. And that is actually also trade. And here you need, again, international cooperation to agree on whether it's the standards issue, whether it's the taxation issue, whether it's the privacy and how we should be having data flows, etc. That is actually one of the big areas for international cooperation and discussion that we must have.
Yep, very good. How about you, Mike?
I don't have that much to add. I would just say the pre-pandemic trend in terms of thinking about security was already there, but the pandemic may have dramatically expanded the scope.
Yep.
So we were talking about technology, now we talk about food and medicine and a whole bunch of other essential things, and beyond that, I agree with Marie. I mean, we just have to do the best we can to create an environment where the security issues don't dominate and override the economic benefits of trade and cooperation.
I think as a businessman and a global trader, what I can say is this trend of reshoring is going to happen. In fact, it has always been the case. Things to do with security, defense has always been domestic, right? Has always been nationalistic and country oriented. What the pandemic has done is expanded the scope of that, into what could be classified as essential products, that must be done nationally, PPE, for example. And then you might even, as you touched on, Marie, go into even certain, food security issues. However, it's not going to mean that everything must be reshored. Everything must be nationalized. It certainly does not make sense. So I think for almost every country, you have to think about a group of essential products which you need to reshore and nationalize, or reshore anyway, I don't want to use the word nationalize, reshore and into local production. And then another set that could actually be non-essential, that in my mind that may even need to be even more globalized because you're trying to create efficiencies on a global basis and create resilient supply chains that would ensure long-term efficient supplies of those non-essential products. So I see a trend of both reshoring of essential products and maybe a continued or maybe even more drastic globalization of the non-essential products. And those are the two competing trends. And those are the trends that every government really need to balance. Now, following up on that, I have another question, which is, looking at the future path of globalization, what do you think would there be large changes in terms of emphasis on the location of production and so on as a result of some of these we're thinking about? What about some of the poorer countries in places like Africa that might be affected? Maybe that question is more addressed to you, Marie.
I think some of the issues are still your traditional economic issues that I think on the trade and productivity, competitiveness kind of situation. I think the countries like in Africa, they are actually not doing trade, a lot of trade between each other. They are importing a lot from Europe, from other countries. So I think there's actually a lot of scope for increasing production domestically. And, I have been for a long time trying to push for more regional economic integration within Africa.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's, if you like, you always say, okay, there is opportunity in the crisis. And I do think digital, again, coming back to digital, we have seen, we are working a lot in Africa to help them digitize, in a rapid way. And in a way, the crisis has actually opened up opportunities for this, because it starts out with, kind of the containment, tracing, and delivery of social assistance. So you start, as you know, in developing countries, one of the big issues is just having an identity, a legal identity, let alone a digital ID. So what is happening in some of the many countries that we are working on is that you are doing simultaneously, okay, we introduce you to have a legal ID as well as a digital ID, so that, and then open a bank account so that you can receive the social assistance. That's a very good first step for you to then build on that as a platform for delivering capacity building as well as economic empowerment programs. And to the extent that you can deliver services through digital means, that's another big opportunity also, I think. And the way, the big question out there is, are consumer preferences going to change so much that, the migration to e-commerce platforms and digital platforms is going to happen so much more faster, which will then create a demand for these services in these countries. So we are actually working a lot in that space. And I sort of, because I've been working on digital and data for a number of years, I kind of see this is really a very good opportunity to accelerate or leapfrog for many developing countries.
Yeah, Marie, I can't agree more. One of the biggest trends that Mike and I talk about all the time is the impact of technology on the global economy. And this is all pre-COVID. I think what we have seen as a result of the pandemic is really an acceleration in the adoption of technology. So to the extent that when we get through all this, and this too shall pass, we're going to actually emerge in a world that is going to be much more technologically driven and more digitalized than we've ever seen before. And this may, in fact, be the opportunity for us to actually think about using that as the basis to actually right some of the inequalities, for the less developed countries to play catch-up ball on the use of technology. And frankly, for businesses to actually embrace this and think about a reinvention of themselves for the new economy. I don't know, Mike, you've been thinking a lot about this. What do you think?
Well, so digital technology is a kind of multi-headed thing, right? So one part of it, which is advancing rapidly, is sort of undercutting some version of the Asian development model, by basically, using robotics and other advances. undercut the, the labor intensive process oriented manufacturing. But and I think it's well known. And so, there's a legitimate reason to worry about what are the big, powerful growth engines in the early stages of development. When I say early stages, I mean, I think, by and large, these digital developments are, net positive in a significant way for middle income and above countries if they can make the adjustments quickly enough. But now I've come around to think, what both of you have said is right. One, there's a huge increase in or reduction in resistance to adoption. There's increased commitment to making the fairly large investment decisions that are required to underpin the digitalization process. And then I think, although it's hard to get it right in focus, I think that it is true that with reasonable global integration and highly and advancements in digitalization in pretty much every kind of economy in the world, you have new growth engines. I personally think mobile payments is absolutely critical.
Yep.
It relates to what Marie just said. If you have a digital identity and a bank account and you're in the mobile payment system, all of a sudden, you've got the infrastructure that you can use to support e-commerce. You can support the elaboration of financial services and so on. Let me just close by mentioning one of the most startling things I've seen in the last 6 months, and I think of this as a positive. I think everybody knows that Reliance Industries in India started a Geo program in 2016. They now have, it's on the order of 360 million subscribers. But the thing that just startled me is they've collected a group of global investors and raised in excess of $13 billion in a matter of 2 months.
Yeah.
And these are pretty smart folks. So I don't think they're in, it's kind of like Facebook and Silver Lake and General Atlantic, which I have an associated, Intel's the latest arrival. I don't think they're in there, for the goodness of their hearts. I mean, they see a real opportunity here, and that kind of supports in a concrete way what Maria was saying.
Yeah. Well, it is amazing how fast 1 hour could go by. I'm looking at the clock and we're really near at the end of our whole session. I must say that we received a torrent of questions, which I don't think I'll have time to actually address to you on this session today. But I think we really appreciate receiving all this. Those questions are really the basis for the Asian Global Institute to frame some of the work that we will be doing and looking into the future. But there's one thing that I really think that has emerged out of this, and it's that theme has just come back again and again in my mind as I go through this hour, is that we really have a very strong need now to really reconceptualize and think through a new form of multilateralism that will be able to carry us through in the post-COVID world. With the impact of technology and all the other issues on sustainability and income inequality rolled in, and especially addressing a world in which we have to really deal with this issue of pandemics. And I think how we actually look at this from a business standpoint, large businesses, small businesses from around the world, is really how we can actually develop a form of cooperation, maybe global supply chains or other forms that will be governed by new rules on trade and so on, and pragmatic way of coming up with a way of addressing some of the issues that we need to deal with. So with that, I think we are very much indebted to our distinguished panelists for joining us today. We've come to the end of our sessions, and obviously we've raised so many questions. This will be room for future Global Thinkers series from the AGI, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon. Thank you very much to all of you.